And you're most welcome to this webinar arranged by Researchers Desk here in Sweden. And we're very keen on understanding more about the fires and the work that you do. And we have a great audience, which is mixed by, it is both scientists and young people and lots of people who are interested in these different kinds of questions. We're also streaming on Facebook. Probably I already told you this, but I missed it. And we have some experts. So if you, now I'm turning to the audience, if you in the audience have any questions, you can ask the questions in Q&A, which you find in the bottom line here. And if you have in the chat, you can share things like if there's an interesting link or something like that. But if you have questions to Dana, you should ask them in the Q&A. And there you can also upvote other questions, because maybe somebody already asked that kind of question that you're wondering of, so we don't get any doublets of the questions. So very warmly welcome, Dana Skelly. I'll leave the floor to you. You can introduce yourself a little bit more than we've done so far, and then we'll have a presentation for about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll leave the floor open for questions.
Well, thanks so much for inviting me to speak. I'll maybe pull up the presentation and introduce myself a little bit as we go through that, if that works for everybody. Okay, so let's see. So I'm here on a wildfire in California, in the United States, of course. I'm here with what we call an incident management team, which we have a system for managing wildfires in the United States that has evolved over the last 100 years, really. The more complicated the fire is, the higher level of an incident management team we would have on it, the more complicated and the longer duration of the fire. So I'm with what we would call a type 1 team. And on this team, my role is fire behavior analyst. And I'll explain a little bit more about what that looks like as we go into the presentation. My day job is I work for the U.S. Forest Service out of Portland, Oregon, and my program is to do vegetation management to help prepare the ecosystem to be more resilient for wildfires, ecosystem and communities. I also work with the Joint Fire Science Governing Board, which is a body in the United States that was created in 1998 to ensure we apply the best available science to management, and that we have mechanisms for management and researchers interacting together so that we can continue to learn from each other and provide tools that make working on fires we're able to use the best available science as we manage. So the picture on the left there, that's me a little over 20 years ago on a prescribed fire in the southeastern US. And just, you know, I chose fire as my career because I'm a conservationist. And in the United States, fire plays a role in every ecosystem. And I'll talk about that here throughout the presentation. But I realized that if I wanted to be a conservationist, if I could learn to work with fire and manage fire, that would be a way to affect landscapes at the broadest possible scale in this country. And so that's what I've spent my career doing. And then the picture on the right on your screens is from the fire that I'm on right now. It's called the Dolan Fire, and it's on the Los Padres National Forest. I took that picture a couple of mornings ago. The fire is mostly burning there in what we would call chaparral. So it's tall, thick brush that's highly flammable. And I'll switch to the next slide. Oops, there we go. And this gives you an idea of the wildfire activity across the country right now. And that little arrow, if you could see down there on the left side of your screen, that's pointing to where I'm calling you from. So, which is where the Dolan Fire is. But you can see there's quite a lot of wildfire activity going on all around the country. The darker the little fire symbol, or the bigger the little fire symbol is, that's the bigger the fire footprint is and the more active it is currently. So, so stepping back to a bigger picture, just in general, every ecosystem is shaped by disturbance. So every forest, every meadow, everything in between, there's some kind of disturbance, ecological disturbance, that influences what you see there, and the vegetation that you see there. Floods, you know, when you have flooding, different periods of flood regimes, and the way streams meander naturally in the course of a stream channel, that creates a disturbance by opening up the banks so that certain kinds of plants can germinate there. Hurricanes, we've learned, clean out the landscape, so plants that aren't shade tolerant can grow up where the trees had shaded them out, and then over time that ecosystem will change and become a forest again. Tornadoes, fires, earthquakes, avalanche, bug infestation, you know, ecosystem disturbance is a natural part of the cycle of life that we are part of, and fire is one of those disturbances. And most of the time, an ecosystem isn't defined by just one kind of disturbance, but a combination of those disturbances. The picture here is from a prescribed fire I was on, also in the Southeast. It's a pitcher plant, and it's a federally listed species because it's endangered. It's called, Latin name is Sarracenia aureophila, which is mountain loving pitcher plant. And it needs prescribed fire to germinate and also to reduce the competition from species that don't do well with fire. So that was a prescribed burn we did to help increase those plants on that landscape and hopefully get it out of being a federally listed species. So a few general principles about fire as a disturbance in ecosystems. And again, I've spent a long time doing this now, and I love what I do, but I know that that not everybody gets to experience fire the way I have. So I'll just say that up front. And I know through the conversation, I'm sure I'll clarify things that are comfortable for me, but maybe are new to you guys and ladies. So basically, everything will burn at some point. It's just about how often it burns and what kind of fire burns it. Fire may not be the main disturbance that makes that ecosystem look the way it does, but everything that is burnable will at some point burn. It's a very common process, and it affects, again, like a wide range of ecosystems. And when I say it's a process that can be manipulated, not only am I talking about the controlled burning that I do as part of my regular job, but all of the suppression that's happened in these ecosystems over the last 100 or more years. We've manipulated our ecosystems by stopping those fires that were part of the process, and that has affected what we manage today. So in this picture, it's some pretty straightforward images, but on the top left is a forest regenerating after a wildfire, some of the ferns that are growing up there. On the right, there's a picture of a giant sequoia grove. And if you do any internet looking at giant sequoias, you'll find that fire is a very critical part in protecting and enhancing sequoia grove health. Those are the large redwood trees all across the coast of California, including where I'm at right now. And then that bottom left picture are pine cones that are what we call serotinous. The way those, pine cones hold the seeds for pine trees that then, create your new forest. There are some pines that are fire adapted that won't open unless you have a wildfire. And that's because the seeds need a clean bed for them to be able to germinate. So the way those trees have evolved over time is that the cones stay closed very tightly until they're heated up enough. Then they open, and the glue that holds the seeds is thinned out by the heat, and the seeds drop. And by then the ground has cooled and the trees can grow. So it's amazing when you start looking into ecosystems, like the nuances and the way they work together to create what you are used to seeing and the complexities of that. So how do we know that fire plays a role in the landscape? This slide is just a couple of the tools that we use to determine, before humans were part of the system, before we imposed ourselves, how did things work? And we use a couple of tools. Some are pollinology and dendrochronology. Palynology is taking cores from sediments in water that doesn't flow very often. So like stream beds that are very deep, or usually lakes. And if you take those cores and you look at them, what you'll see is it's just like sedimentary rock. You'll see pollen that we can identify back to plants over 1,000 years, several thousand years in places where we've had persistent lake beds. You can see, which can tell you like about agriculture in the area from Native Americans. It can tell you about what the climate looked like and what kind of plants it supported. And you will also see in those sedimentary layers bits of charcoal that tell you how often there were fires, and depending on the depth of the charcoal, how much fire there was at a given time. So in some ecosystems, palynology is a great way to get several thousand years of climate record that shows you the kinds of plants and then also the kinds of fire that you had across a landscape. The dendrochronology is tree rings, and whenever you have a wildfire, if it's severe enough, you will see a record of it in the tree ring growth. And so not only can we take living trees, we could take dead trees, we could take logs from wood cabins and historic structures. And you can, there's even a work going on at the University of Arizona where they're taking pieces of a pier from the Roman Empire, and they've been drying them out and looking at the tree rings there. So you can piece this kind of information back thousands of years and not just get a record of fire based on where you see the charcoal in the rings, but based on how wide or how thin the trees rings are, you can look at all kinds of climate patterns. And scientists all over the world use dendrochronology as a way to look at both fire and fire across a landscape, and then also, again, climate patterns. So when we look at those big picture records, and then we can also look at records like repeat photography. And in this image, it's a ponderosa pine forest from the Western United States about the turn of the last century in the early 1900s. You can see it's a really open stand. There's a gentleman there for perspective. The trees are fairly large and well spaced. This picture on the bottom is the same forest, and you could see how much more dense it is. It's very difficult to even see any of those large trees with all the other young trees growing up. So for more modern times, this is a really good way to show how our forests have changed. And a lot of that has to do with our social values, how we manage the landscape, and then other impacts over time. So diving a little deeper into fire on the landscape and how that relates to those different images that we see and the kinds of plants and the distribution of the plants. In this image, what you see is again a ponderosa pine forest. Ponderosa pine forests are just a very straightforward example for fire ecology, and they're very, very well studied. So the top picture is what we would call a ponderosa pine forest functioning within the historic range of variability. And the disturbance that help maintain this forest is fire. And so we would have periodic fires, and these were most often started by lightning, but Native Americans, we know, definitely used fire for hunting and for growing certain foods. It was a very important thing. But when we look at our ecosystems and we try to determine the role of fire, what I've come to understand is it doesn't matter so much what set the fire. The thing that you really need to focus on is what's a functioning landscape, and what do you need to see in there that you don't see, and did fire play a role or not? It doesn't really matter how the fire got there. It matters more that you used to have this plant, and this plant has a seed that needs to be opened up by fire. And that means that if we don't see that plant anymore, we're not seeing enough fire. And so we need to get more fire back in there to get that plant back. And so in that top image, there were frequent fires that were low severity and low intensity that would go across a landscape until they either ran out of what we call fuel, which is the burnable vegetation, or the weather changed and it put the fire out. And you could see that with the way the trees are spaced, and the amount of grass and dead and down wood that's on the ground, that fire stayed low the flame lengths that you see are less than a meter, across there. You also can see that there's very few limbs that go all the way to the ground on those trees. These fires would naturally prune the trees and lift the canopy so that when they would come through, they're less likely to get up into the crowns and create a kind of fire that is much more destructive, higher severity, and more resistant to control. So in that bottom image, and it's like that repeat photography from the last slide, you see a forest that hasn't had periodic fire, and it hasn't had any kind of logging or other manipulation. And what happens there is that, and we've stopped the fires, right? So now the forest is more dense, and there's a lot more what we call ladder fuel, which is shrubs and small trees that go all the way up into the canopy. And then you could see the flames there are much higher and much more dense. So I think one of the things that you might want to think about here is like, well, if you had to come up on a fire, which fire makes you less comfortable? Probably the fire on the bottom. That's the kind of fire, though, that we're facing more and more because of the way we've chosen to suppress fires, because of the way we've looked at the role of fire in the landscape, and nowadays, because of other social constructs that we have. But when we also look at managing these fires, in the U.S., from the very beginning of your career in fire, we have kind of a rule of thumb that if the flame lengths are less than about a meter, then that's something that you can attack, you can manage with just a hand tool and hand crews. When you get flame lengths that are between 1 and 2 meters, that's when you start needing equipment like a fire engine to help you with that, because those flame lengths are now, getting a little more dangerous, and it's a little, it's not possible to we would say attack, to work on those fires without that kind of additional help safely. Once you get over 3 meters in flame length, that's when we really need to start using much heavier equipment like bulldozers or aircraft to be able to safely manage and extinguish that fire. So when we think about trying to keep fire away from communities, towns and people, anything we can do to keep the fire more like the first picture rather than the second is in everybody's best interest, and it's something that we can manage with fewer resources, fewer firefighting resources. But also, if an ecosystem evolved with the kind of fire you see in the first image, but what we get is the kind of fire you see in the second image, you may not get that ecosystem back because the severity is such that the way the ecosystem function, it cannot regenerate. You may have changed that landscape forever. And we've seen that in parts of the desert Southwest. So just kind of coming towards the last bit of the discussion here before we get to your questions. So these are just some general things that we're seeing about climate change and wildfires in the US. We're seeing more fires that are longer, and we're seeing longer droughts. We're seeing longer fire seasons. They've increased up to 80 days in locations of the Western US, and they used to maybe only last for a month on average. And we're looking at a likelihood of 2 to 4 times more annual area burned by 2050. And honestly, after fire seasons like this, we see exponential increases in these estimates. So I would expect some of these facts to change quickly after we evaluate what happened this year. But maybe another way to look at it is this, like when I trained in fire, this is what we would think of as what we call the wildland urban interface. You could see a ranch, you could see the forest behind it. That is an air tanker that's dropping fire retardant to protect the ranch, and a couple of our fire engines in the foreground. This is the kind of fire that I trained for, that balance of protecting rural areas and protecting our natural landscapes. On that same day when we had that fire, my friend and my counterpart was on another fire. The first picture was in Oregon. This picture is from Washington State in the Northwest US. And this is the kind of fire we're getting now. It's the same kind of plane also dropping retardant, but you can see the density of houses is much greater and the fire is very close to those houses. This fire burned down quite a few houses in those subdivisions. And that's some of the change too. It's where people live, It's that interface of homes and the fire environment. And so starting to bring us in for a landing here, when we talk about applying the best available science to what we do, when we look at our weather data, that's a really big part of this. And this is an example. The energy release component is a way we characterize the fire environment. It takes into account area trends and weather and how they impact, again, the fuels, which is the dead and down woody material and the trees and the shrubs, and how that translates into fire behavior. If we have weather stations all over the country to help us with this data. But what we've learned over the last 10 or maybe even 15 years is that we can no longer use all the data that's available to us, because if we do, it brings our averages down, which means that our fire predictions are not realistic with the environment that we're seeing. And here in this graph, you can see an example where if you look at the weather data from 1978 to 1998, and you compare it to weather data in that same weather station from 1999 to 2017, you can see that the average of this index that we use for modeling is much lower than the average from recent times. That translates into models like this, where we run simulated fires across a landscape to look at the probability of a fire impacting any given piece of the landscape over a couple of weeks of time. If we use the entire weather data available, those indices would be on average lower and our predictions would be less. That is not responsible. We need to be strategic with limited resources and make the best decisions that we can, not just for protecting houses, but for protecting our fire crews that are working on the line. So here's an image from the fire that I'm on now, and it's what we call a backfiring operation. And what we're doing here, so when you want to stop a fire with your crews and your air equipment and your bulldozers, what you're doing is you're taking the burnable vegetation, the fuel, away so that the fire has nothing to burn. But sometimes you can see, like in this, where you have the needles that almost touch across a road. You don't want to, you may not be able to cut down all those trees. You may not want to cut down all those trees. One way to help stop the fire is by setting another fire to also take away that fuel. And that's what the crews are doing here too. So they're setting what we call a backfire off of one of our lines that we're using the engines and aircraft to hold. And that's removing the fuel so that when the main fire hits it, it will go out because there's nothing left to burn. We use all that modeling that I just touched on to help us show where we'll be most successful with doing these backfires as one tool. And then just really quickly, when we look at all the data, it gives us an idea of how often the landscape would have burned. And when we use that as a way to reference how much we should be treating before we have the wildfires, we're at a fire deficit. Across the whole United States, the estimates are that between wildfires and our fuels treatments, we're treating 45% of what would have burned on an average year with wildfire. We aren't keeping up. And it's very challenging to keep up as the climate changes around us. And I'm sure you guys will have questions about that. So I'll just kind of move to this last slide so we can get to your questions. This is from where I used to work in South Florida. I've had the really fortunate experience of working all over the United States in my job. And this is the pine rockland ecosystem. There's less than 2% of that historic range left, mostly because of development and social values. But it's also at the front edge of climate change. These pine rockland systems are dependent on having a freshwater lens that sits on top of the saltwater for the trees and the plants that you see to exist. They also burn very frequently. That's what maintains the open spacing and the grass diversity and the shrub layers like you see it. With sea level rise, not only are we having less freshwater lens, so these ecosystems are getting encroached, but when we have storms like hurricanes, the little bit of sea level rise is greatly increasing storm surge, which means that these systems that might have had a large footprint are now getting pushed back with salt water when we have hurricanes come through and the storm surge related to those. It gives a lot of parallels to what we're doing, and it helps us think about, again, like what I think a lot of my talk, hopefully for you, is like when you have limited resources for conservation work, for managing a fire, how do you focus strategically on what you're going to conserve and protect? There's a lot of tools available to it, but part of that discussion has to be like, where are we at? Where are we going? And what can we really protect? And how about I leave us there and switch off the screen, and Martin, kick this back to you.